Could a name sitting quietly in your family tree connect you to one of the most famous ships in history? And what if the proof has been sitting there for generations, hidden behind marriages, changed last names, and 400 years of forgotten stories? If family history pulls you in, take 5 seconds right now. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with one relative who is always saying, "We came from somebody important." In September of 1620, a small wooden ship left England carrying just over 100 passengers into an ocean that did not care whether they lived or died. They were not all the same. Some were driven by faith, some were hired hands, some were children, some were practical people with useful skills. Some had no idea that their names would echo through American history. They were supposed to reach Virginia. They did not. Storms pushed them off course. They arrived far to the north, cold, uncertain, and badly exposed. Before they could even build a real life, winter hit them like a hammer. By the time that first brutal season ended, about half of them were gone. Think about what that means. These were not names in a clean list in a textbook. These were people shivering through salt air, grief, hunger, sickness, and fear. Husbands buried wives, children lost parents, parents buried children. The colony that later became a symbol of beginnings almost ended before it truly began, and yet it did not end. The people who survived stayed. They built, they married, they had children, those children had children, and those families spread, crossed counties, crossed colonies, crossed state lines, and mixed with hundreds of other bloodlines. Over 4 centuries, the trail became harder to see. In many cases, the original Mayflower surname did not survive in a straight line. A daughter married into another family. A widow remarried. A granddaughter carried the blood but not the name. A famous ancestor became invisible simply because the last name changed. That is why this topic matters. When people ask, "Do I have Mayflower ancestry?" they often ask the wrong question. They think they need a famous last name sitting right there in their tree. But history is messier than that. The name may be gone while the line remains. A Bradford daughter could become part of a different household. A Mullins line could disappear into the Alden family. A Tilly child could survive, marry, and pass the connection forward, while the original surname fades from view. So tonight, we are not just looking at names, we are looking at survival, at inheritance, and at the strange way history hides inside ordinary families. And here's the big reason this video may hit closer to home than you expect. Scholars and genealogists have long pointed out that millions of Americans descend from the passengers of the Mayflower, not thousands, millions. One small ship, one voyage, one surviving colony, then 400 years of family lines expanding in every direction. If your roots reach back into early New England, there is a real chance the story touches your tree somewhere, even if the connection does not look obvious at first glance. So let's do this the right way. Not as a dry list, not as a school lecture. Let's walk through the surnames as human stories, because the stories are what make the names stick. Start with Bradford. If there is one name that feels carved into the early memory of Plymouth, it is Bradford. William Bradford was not just a passenger. He became one of the central minds of the colony. He had lost parents young. He had already known instability before he ever crossed the Atlantic. In England, he had joined a separatist religious movement that faced pressure and danger. That path led him first to the Netherlands and then toward the decision that would define his life. But before his name became tied to leadership, it was tied to loss. After the ship reached Cape Cod, Bradford's wife Dorothy fell overboard and drowned. Imagine that moment. You survived the Atlantic crossing. Land is finally there. The ordeal should be ending. Instead, the person beside you is suddenly gone before your new life even begins. Bradford carried that grief into the colony he would help shape. He later served as governor for many years and wrote one of the most important first-hand accounts of Plymouth's early history. Without his writing, much of what people think they know about the Mayflower years would be thinner, dimmer, and less certain. His words became a bridge between the suffering of that first generation and the memory of everyone who came later. So if Bradford appears in your family line, you're not just looking at a surname, you're looking at one of the main record keepers of the entire story. Then there's Alden, and this one matters because it breaks the image many people have of the Mayflower passengers. John Alden was not one of the religious pilgrims in the purest sense. He was hired for work. He was a cooper, a barrel maker, a practical man with a practical skill. He came because ships and settlements needed supplies stored properly. That detail is important. The Mayflower was not only a spiritual mission, it was also a fragile human project that needed labor and trade skills. It needed food systems, repair work, and plain usefulness. And somehow, this hired craftsman became one of the biggest ancestral figures to come out of Plymouth. Alden stayed. He married Priscilla Mullins. Their line exploded across generations. That one decision, to remain in the colony instead of leaving, helped create one of the most widespread descendant networks. If you ever hear somebody talk about ancestry as if history is only moved by famous leaders, remember John Alden. Sometimes history turns because an ordinary skilled worker decides not to get back on a boat. But Alden's story does not fully land unless you pair it with Mullins. William Mullins came prepared not just to survive, but to outfit a settlement. Records from his estate show that he brought a striking number of shoes and boots with him, along with other goods. That little detail opens a window into the world of the voyage. These people were not abstract symbols. They were carrying material plans for a real community. Clothing mattered, leather mattered, trade mattered, daily life mattered. William Mullins died in that first terrible winter. So did other close family members. But his daughter Priscilla survived. She married John Alden. Through that marriage, the Mullins story kept going even when the surname itself began fading into another line. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes family research so tricky. You may not have Mullins in your tree and still descend from William Mullins through Priscilla. The bloodline survives. The name it may not. Now think about that pattern for a second. A father dies. A daughter survives. A marriage changes the household name. 400 years later, descendants may have no idea that an ancestor on the Mayflower sits behind a different surname. This is why genealogy is half detective work and half humility. Then we get to one of the most dramatic survival stories on the entire ship, Howland. John Howland was a young man traveling with John Carver's household. During the crossing, the sea turned violent. At some point in the storm, Howland went overboard, in the North Atlantic, in 1620. Under normal logic, that should have been the end of him. A man dropped into those waters was not supposed to come back. But he caught hold of a trailing rope, and he held on long enough to be pulled back aboard. Just stop there for a moment. If his hand misses, even for a second, generations vanish. Entire family lines disappear before they begin. Future children are never born. Future marriages never happen. Whole branches of American history simply do not exist in the same way. One grip on one rope changed that. Howland later married Elizabeth Tilley, another survivor, marked by devastating loss. Her parents died in the first winter, so did relatives who might have cared for her. She was still very young, orphaned in a place that barely qualified as a functioning colony. The pairing of Howland and Tilley feels almost impossible when you think about the odds. A man who nearly vanished into the ocean marries a girl who survives the collapse of her family. Together, they become the start of a massive descendant line. This is where history stops feeling distant. It becomes intimate. It becomes almost fragile. And since we just said Tilley, let's stay there a little longer. Because the Tilley line shows the emotional truth behind so many Mayflower descendants. John and Joan Tilley did not live long in the New World. Their daughter Elizabeth did. She became the vessel through which that family continued. That matters, because viewers may be searching for male surnames, when the real connection may come through a daughter, a granddaughter, or a widow who carried the line forward in silence. Quick pause before we go on. If one of these stories has already made you think about your own family, hit subscribe. Leave a comment with the oldest surname you know in your line, and send this video to a relative. The same kind of hidden legacy appears with White. William and Susanna White came on the voyage with their young son. Another son, Peregrine White, was born during the Mayflower's time at Cape Cod. That image alone is unforgettable. A child entering the world while the ship sat in uncertainty. Before the future of the colony was even clear, the name Peregrine itself carries the feel of journey. He is often remembered as the first English child born to the Mayflower passengers in New England, and he lived a long life compared with many of the adults who brought him there. But once again, survival came with grief. William White died during the first winter. Susanna White survived and later married Edward Winslow. Their marriage became one of the first important unions in Plymouth after the disaster. They connect through death, remarriage, adaptation, and necessity. And that brings us straight to Winslow. Edward Winslow was one of the colony's most capable men when it came to diplomacy and communication. In a settlement where bad decisions could be fatal, that mattered. He helped shape relationships that gave Plymouth a better chance to survive. He also left behind one of the key written accounts tied to the early colony and the first Thanksgiving. So just as Bradford helps preserve memory through writing, Winslow also stands close to the documentary record. But what makes the Winslow line compelling is not only politics or paperwork, it is the emotional texture. His first wife died in the first winter. Then he married Susanna White, who had also been widowed. This was not romance in the modern cinematic sense. This was survival. This was two people rebuilding structure out of devastation. Now let's talk about a different name, Standish. Miles Standish was not a pilgrim in the narrow religious sense. He was a professional soldier. Groups built on conviction often still need somebody who understands force, defense, and risk. The passengers' new belief alone would not protect a weak settlement. Standish brought military experience. He knew how to think about danger in practical terms. He also suffered loss. His wife Rose died. Still, he remained. And his role in Plymouth became outsized because survival required more than prayer. It required judgment about threats, readiness, and order. That is one of the reasons the story is complicated. The colony was not built by one type of person. It was built by believers, workers, widows, and soldiers. Another perfect example of that complexity is Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins was not making his first trip to America. While many on the ship were heading into the unknown, Hopkins had already survived a wreck. He had experience. He knew more than most of the others about the Atlantic world they were entering. That gave him a special kind of value. In moments of uncertainty, experience can matter as much as leadership. His past is one of the wildest. He had survived the sea venture disaster near Bermuda, a wreck so famous it has often been linked to the inspiration behind Shakespeare's The Tempest. Then he returned to England. Then he crossed again on the Mayflower. That is not a timid man. That is the profile of someone who had already seen the edge of disaster and still chose the ocean. And even his household carries unforgettable detail. His son Oceanus was born during the voyage, literally named from the world of water that surrounded them. It is a detail that sounds almost too symbolic. But it is exactly the kind of detail that makes the Mayflower passengers feel startlingly human. Then there is Brewster, a surname that carries the weight of faith more directly than most. William Brewster was one of the elder religious figures. He had education and had lived close to power. By the time the Mayflower sailed, Brewster represented continuity. He was one of the older anchors. People often reduce early colonial religion to a stereotype, but for men like Brewster, belief was structure. It was identity. It was the reason the risk seemed worth taking even when it looked unthinkable. Now, every history like this has a rough edge, and one of the roughest names is Billington. The Billington family had a reputation for trouble. They challenged authority, they stirred conflict. One story involves a dangerous incident with a firearm while the ship was still near Cape Cod. Later, John Billington became infamous for being executed after killing another colonist. That rips away the myth that everyone on the ship was noble, gentle, and united in purpose. But even here the story twists. A Billington child is remembered for spotting a body of fresh water. So within one family, you see disorder and usefulness side by side. That is history in its real form. If you are enjoying this, here is your second checkpoint. Save this video and subscribe. Share it with one cousin, aunt, or grandparent. Family stories spread best when families talk. Now let's talk about Warren, because the Warren line carries a different kind of emotional force. Richard Warren crossed without his full family beside him. His wife and daughters joined him later. That means he survived the voyage and the first hard years while waiting for reunion. We often talk about the crossing as a single leap, but for many families it was staggered and uncertain. When the rest of the Warren household arrived, the emotional meaning of that reunion must have been enormous. Imagine surviving disease and hunger in a new colony while not knowing if your family would make it. The Warren descendants later spread widely, meaning a family once defined by distance multiplied the legacy. The Cook family reflects another version of that same pattern. Francis Cook made the crossing alone first. The migration happened in layers. That matters for anyone researching ancestry in the colonial record. If you search too narrowly, you may miss the link. And then there is Fuller. Samuel Fuller served as a kind of doctor in a world where medicine was uncertain and limited. During the first winter, a man like Fuller would have carried an impossible burden. Imagine trying to help people when the tools you have are weak and death is everywhere. The painful irony is that Fuller later died during an epidemic after spending years trying to care for others. It reminds us how little control these people really had over exhaustion, weather, and chance. The Allerton name opens yet another door into complexity. Isaac Allerton handled trade and finance. But his story turned controversial. Trust, money, and self-interest collided. Human communities always struggle with power. What makes the Allerton line memorable is that his daughter Mary lived for decades after the voyage. She is remembered as the last surviving Mayflower passenger. A child arrives, and the world transforms. One by one, the others disappear. Yet she remains, a living thread reaching back to that first crossing. Circle back to Tilly and Howland together. Two lives nearly erased in different ways, yet from them came a huge line of descendants. That is why ancestry matters emotionally. The Mayflower story is not really about famous people. It is about vulnerable people remaining alive. A governor matters, but so does a young mother, a craftsman, and a teenager who keeps going. When you hear Bradford, hear a man writing history after burying his wife. When you hear Alden, hear a worker. When you hear Mullins, hear a father whose surviving daughter carried the line into a different name. When you hear Howland, hear cold Atlantic water and one desperate grip. When you hear Tilly, hear an orphan. When you hear White, hear a child born in uncertainty. When you hear Standish, hear the soldier. When you hear Hopkins, hear the man who crossed the ocean twice. When you hear Brewster, hear conviction. When you hear Billington, hear trouble. When you hear Warren, hear waiting in slow assembly. The question is whether one of these stories is hiding there under another name entirely. Pull up the oldest branch of your family. Look for New England locations and 17th century marriages. Look for women whose maiden names disappeared. A Mayflower connection often shows up sideways. Give the video a like and post your oldest family surname in the comments to compare notes. Maybe the real connection runs through a branch nobody talks about. Memory simplifies while records complicate. People grow up hearing vague claims, but buried under exaggeration, there's often a real line. And when you find it, something changes. A ship becomes a chain of names leading to you. The names are famous because they lasted long enough for the lines to spread and merge. Follow the line. Ask who married whom. Ask which daughters carried the story forward. Ask whether the name survived, or whether only the bloodline did. Names are just the beginning. Family history is about finding the true story, whatever it is. The value is in knowing. Somewhere on that ship were people who could not possibly imagine us or modern databases. They were thinking about weather, hunger, and whether spring would come in time to stay alive. That is the scale of the distance between their world and ours. And still, a name can cross it. A marriage line can cross it. A child can cross it. And maybe your tree crosses it too. Hidden inside many family myths is a smaller, stranger, truer story waiting to be found right now. If that story leads back to the Mayflower, you're discovering one of the hardest beginnings in history. Either way, you are rescuing real people from oblivion. That is a journey worth taking. Because the past is never just behind you. Sometimes it is sitting there quietly, waiting for you to notice.